exercise. Okay, so today's speaker, we're really lucky. Doug Elmendorf is here. He's the only the eighth actually, director of the Congressional Budget Office. And I do think it's pretty remarkable, I mentioned this to him earlier, that in this incredibly political environment that this CBO for a long time, I don't know, 40 years or however long it's been, has maintained a reputation of absolute integrity in such a political world. So I think it's great, and Doug has definitely continued that great reputation. He took over in January of 2009 after Peter Orszag went into the administration. He filled out Peter's term. When he was appointed first, you're appointed by the head of the congressional leadership, Speaker of the House and the Senate, Majority Leader of the Senate. So they were both Democrats in 2009. So interestingly, when he got reappointed, the Republicans had taken the House, and he still got reappointed. So that kind of indicates that he has that integrity that both sides appreciate. And I think that speaks well for Doug and speaks well for the institution. His term ends, his second term, in January 2015, but I have a secret source that there is no term limit, so he could get appointed yet again. Before heading the CBO, he had a chaired position. It was the Edward Bernstein Scholar at Brookings Institution. And he previously had been an assistant professor at Harvard. Then he's actually had quite a long career in the government. He actually was a senior principal analyst at the CBO early in his career. And then he became a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. Then he became Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury. Then he became Assistant Director of the Division of Research and Statistics of the Federal Reserve Board. So he's moved around Washington a lot over the years. In those positions, he's worked on a lot of things: budget policy, Social Security, Medicare, healthcare policy, financial markets, macroeconomic forecasting and analysis, and so forth. His graduate degrees are from Harvard University, and his undergraduate degree is from Princeton. And so with Harvard and Princeton, Stanford is the missing part of his education. So we'll teach you something here later today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That nice introduction. I'm delighted to be at SIEPR and to be with all of you. Let's dive right in. Under current law, the future of the federal budget will be strikingly different from its past in two key ways. First, federal debt will be much larger relative to the size of the economy than it has been in almost all of our history. And second, and equally consequential, I think, for policymakers and for us as citizens, a much larger share of federal spending will go to benefits for older Americans and for healthcare, and a much smaller share will go to other activities. I want to spend my half hour or so talking about those 2 points. I'll go through a number of slides fairly quickly, but we can come back if there are things you have questions about. And if you're really struck by all this, these slides will be on our website tomorrow morning. Let me begin, though, first with just 2 slides to explain who we are and what we do, for those of you who don't know. So our job is to provide objective, nonpartisan information to the Congress. We've been doing this for 39 years. We make what we call baseline projections of what will happen to the federal budget under current law, and we make estimates of the effects of changes in federal policies, sometimes in collaboration with JCT, which is an acronym that stands for the Joint Committee on Taxation, and they have some role on the revenue side of the budget. It's analogous to what we do on the spending side of the budget, although we also do revenue work as well. And we do estimates of proposals, specific legislation that's coming out of congressional committees, but also of conceptual proposals that are being developed on the Hill or elsewhere. Very importantly, we make no recommendations. We make no recommendations because policy choices inevitably involve value judgments as well as analytic work. Our job is to bring to the Congress information about the consequences of alternative policies, but to let them, on our behalf, all of our behalf, make the choices about policies. Now, the estimates that we do focus on the next 10 years, but sometimes go out longer. And they go out longer when we think there is something distinctive happening beyond the normal budget window that we want to point out to the Congress. Our estimates are meant to reflect the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. We are well aware of the uncertainty of our work. In a number of cases, we try to present ranges of answers, but in every case, we think of what we're doing as being in the middle of a range. We incorporate behavioral responses to the extent that we can, based on whatever evidence is available and the time that we have to use it. We change our answers sometimes. If we've done new analysis, or folks at SIEPR have done new analysis, we take that on board. And if we have occasion to change our views, then we spell it out very publicly in our reports to the Congress of what we've read or what calculations we've done that have led us to a different conclusion than we had before. And we try to provide explanations to the analysis to the extent that we can. We do not want the work we do to be a black box. We do a lot of estimates, 600 written estimates this year, probably 6,000 informal estimates conveyed by email or over the telephone. Not everything can be entirely documented, but where we can, we try to spell out what we've done and why. So outside people can read it and can find what they like or don't like about it. And by communicating what they don't like, then we can do a better job the next time. Okay, so that is preamble. Let's get down to the budget. Under current law, what is the outlook for overall federal deficits, debt, spending, and revenues? Then I'll dig into the composition of that. So this is a picture of federal deficits or surpluses, looking back 40 years, up through 2007. If you then add a few points, you can see the deficit ballooned in 2009. If I'd drawn this a few years ago, we wouldn't have had the scale go down that far. And that's because, of course, of the sharp recession and the fall in tax revenue in particular, because of the downturn in the economy, but also the policies that were adopted to deal with the downturn. Since then, deficits have been shrinking. And last year, the deficit was down pretty close to the average of the last 40 years. And we think this year will actually be a little below the average of the last 40 years as a share of GDP. Then deficits start to rise again a little over the coming decade. But they're not going to be particularly large by historical standards. What will be different by historical standards is the level of debt. So federal debt held by the public. This picture begins in 1940, so you can see the peak at the end of the Second World War. Then the debt declined, not particularly because the government ran surpluses, basically because the government roughly balanced its budget and the economy grew. So we weren't adding to the debt and GDP was growing. So debt as a share of GDP came down. And then it went basically sideways from 1965 into 2007. There were ups and downs that seemed consequential at the time, but again, given the current scale of the picture, are a little dwarfed by the run-up in debt that we had in 2010, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Very large deficits accumulating to a big run-up in debt. And debt is now higher than it's been since about 1950. And looking ahead, we expect that debt as a share of GDP will move sideways a bit and then up. So again, the striking difference from the past is not the annual deficits we see in the next few years. It is the very high level of debt. And then beyond the next decade, as I will talk about, deficits continue to rise. So if you look at overall spending and revenues, just to start digging in a little bit, you can see that revenues are now, this year, last year, pretty close to their historical average share of GDP. Revenues have increased and decreased over time relative to GDP, partly because of economic events. So again, you can see the very sharp drop in 2009 from the weak economy, but also in response to policy changes. So you can see a run-up in revenues as a share of GDP in the late 70s into the early 80s, and then the drop in response to the tax cuts of the early 80s. And you can see a run-up in revenues relative to GDP in the 1990s, and then a drop in response to the tax cuts in the early 2000s. The other line shows spending, which of course has been above revenues almost every year, except for a few in the late 1990s. Spending is also now just about its historical average share of GDP, but is on a track to increase, and we will dig into that projected uptrend momentarily. I'm going to talk mostly about spending, but I want to just dig into revenues for one slide. I think something important to understand here. So as I'm showing here, overall revenues are about equal to their historical average share of GDP. In CBO terms, we use the last 40 years as the standard basis for comparison. But if you look at individual income groups in the population, not every income group is paying taxes close to its historical average burden. So let me explain what this chart means. And we'll start with the bottom. The bottom line shows the taxes paid by the lowest quintile, people in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, as a share of their income. This is not their tax bracket. It's not the rate they would pay on an extra dollar of income. It's their total taxes divided by their total income. And we interpret total pretty broadly. So total taxes here includes not only the taxes that you would think of paying directly, like income taxes or your share of payroll taxes. It includes the employer's share of payroll taxes, and it includes corporate taxes that we attribute to households based on their capital ownership. And income is also measured fairly broadly. You can see the lowest quintile, and I should say the real data we had when we did this report went through 2010. We did an extrapolation for 2013, and that's why those points aren't quite connected. But in 2013, last year, our estimate was that taxes paid by the lowest quintile were close to the low end of the range of their tax burden over the preceding 30 years. And the middle 60% of the population, again, taxes close to the low end of their range. And the 81st to 99th percentiles, again, taxes close to the low end of the range of the past 30 years. What is different is that taxes for the top 1% are up at the high end of the range they've been over the last 30 years. In addition, of course, more income is now being received by people in the top 1% than was true over most of the years shown in this chart. So that combination of their paying a higher tax rate and their having more income is what has kept revenues overall about the same share of GDP they've been historically. But the average person in the other income groups, of course, individual experience can vary a lot, but the average person in those income groups is actually paying a smaller share of their income in taxes than has been the case for most of the past 30 years. Okay, so with that quick dive into revenue, let me press on to spending. And this is where I want to focus most of our attention, which is how, under current law, the composition of federal spending will change. So let's begin with a picture from 2006, actually. So this picture shows for elderly households, the left-hand bar is the transfer payments they receive. This is Social Security benefits, it's Medicare benefits, and it's some Medicaid benefits. Remember, Medicaid is the program that focuses on low-income people, but a number of those low-income people are older Americans. In particular, Medicare doesn't pay much for nursing home care, and Medicaid pays quite a bit. So that transfer bar is a combination of the cash transfers and the healthcare benefits primarily. Elderly households pay some taxes on average, but the transfers they receive outweigh the taxes they pay, so they receive positive transfers minus taxes. If you go over to non-elderly households, with children and without children, you see a rather different picture than for the elderly. Those households receive much less in the way of transfers, pay more in taxes. More in taxes mostly because they're at a point in their lives where they are earning more money, and at a point in their lives where the transfer payments are less generous. So they're paying more in taxes than they're receiving in transfer benefits. And in the report from which I drew this slide, we looked at a lot of different programs, and we looked at a lot of different breakdowns among households. That gives you a sense about what's important in the federal budget and where the money may be going. We can do a little more precise look at 2013. This is a breakdown of all federal spending. It was about $3.5 trillion. And the point I think to note here particularly is that a few programs account for a very large share of the spending. So Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid together account for about 45% of all federal spending last year. Another big chunk you can see for defense, and then what's called non-defense discretionary spending. And I should explain that discretionary spending is the spending which the Congress votes every year how much funding to allocate and to what purpose to allocate it. So that part of the chart is the part that the Congress votes on each year. The other part of the chart, called mandatory spending, it's not really mandatory, it's up to the Congress, but it operates in a way where it mostly keeps going from year to year without congressional action. And it keeps going according to benefit rules, mostly. There are other types of programs. Most of that money goes out according to certain benefit rules. And without explicit action, that just keeps happening. Whereas appropriations, if there's no action, then the government actually shuts down in a particular sort of odd sort of way. So I should say here, this big part of non-defense discretionary spending is a whole collection of programs: highways, education, veterans health care, homeland security, most other things. The other mandatory spending is mostly benefit programs I had not highlighted here, like food stamps, for example. Okay, so that's 2013. So let's try to get a little more perspective on this. This picture shows Social Security benefits as a share of GDP on average over the last 40 years. And the other bars show the major healthcare programs: Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP, which is the Children's Health Insurance Program, is in there, but it's much smaller. And then all other non-interest spending, defense, all the other non-defense activities. That's what things have looked like on average over the last 40 years. If you look at 2014, you see Social Security is a little bit bigger, mostly because the leading edge of the baby boomers are now in retirement and collecting benefits. The major healthcare programs are a lot bigger, and we'll talk about the sources of growth in those programs in a minute. And other non-interest spending is actually smaller relative to the size of the economy. If we roll out to 2024, you can see Social Security continues to grow as more baby boomers retire. Healthcare programs grow very rapidly, and we'll dig into that, as I said, in a moment. Everything else the government does is shrinking as a share of the economy under current law. And it's shrinking so much that by 2020, under current law, federal spending for Social Security and the major healthcare programs will be roughly 50% larger relative to GDP than it has been on average during the past 40 years. But federal spending for all other programs taken together will be a smaller percentage of GDP than it has been in at least 70 years. The data we draw from are harder to get before 1940 or so. So that's the shifting priorities. Money is going a very different set of activities than has gone before. And those shifts are in some ways much more dramatic than the uptrend in overall government spending as a share of the economy. But of course, those things are related. So let's look a little more closely at healthcare. Federal spending for major healthcare programs will increase as a share of GDP for three main reasons going forward. The first is the aging of the population. There'll be 1/3 more beneficiaries of Social Security and Medicare at the end of this decade than there are today. So even if the benefit costs were exactly the same per person, the aggregate costs would be 1/3 larger. And that second thing for healthcare programs is rising cost of healthcare per person. And the third thing is the expansion of federal subsidies for health insurance through Medicaid and the exchanges under what we call the Affordable Care Act, and you may have other nicknames you use, but I can't. This is a picture that shows the share of the population age 65 or older. It's rising substantially. And we are just right now really at the beginning of the steep part of that curve. This chart's a little weedier, but I'll spend just 2 minutes on it. This is growth in healthcare spending per beneficiary in excess of GDP growth per person. So it's something that health economists refer to sometimes as excess cost growth. Not necessarily wrong, just meaning in excess of the growth of GDP. So you can see over the history here that, first of all, on average, healthcare spending per person has outpaced GDP per person. That's the source of the rising burden on the federal budget, on state and local budgets, on firms, on households. You'll also see that that growth rate is quite volatile. There was a very sharp slowdown in the mid-1990s and a sharp slowdown in the past few years. Our projections going forward start with some sort of weighted average of the last few decades, and that's what those dashed lines are about. We think there'll be some slowdown, in fact, in this underlying rate of growth as the rising burden weighs on households and state and local governments and companies and as changes are made. But on top of all of that, there are a lot of program-specific things that we take into account in our projections that I won't go into here. So under current law, federal spending for each major healthcare program will grow rapidly. The top line shows Medicare spending. Again, that's being pushed up by the retirement of baby boomers and growing costs per person. There's Medicaid and CHIP spending being pushed up by rising costs per person, by the aging of the population, but also by the very large expansion in Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. And then the bottom line is exchange subsidies. These are the spending part of the tax credits for health care purchased through insurance, health insurance purchased through these exchanges. These are projections, of course. We could be wrong. Just want to make sure nobody thinks that I think this is necessarily going to come to pass. But we do think these projections are in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. Spending could be higher or it could be lower. So the effects of the Affordable Care Act are quite apparent here in the growth rates, and they were apparent, just to go back into this chart, I had a few charts earlier, where you can see the importance in the numbers of the expansion of insurance subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. But to go back forward again, despite that expansion, it's worth understanding that even after the Affordable Care Act is fully implemented, most federal dollars for health care will go to support older people. In 2024, this is our projection of Medicare spending and Medicaid and CHIP and the exchange subsidies. If you break that down by groups in the population, about 3/5 of the money goes to folks over the age of 65. About 1/5 will go to people who are blind and disabled, and about 1/5 will go to non-elderly, able-bodied people. The disability part here is quite important, and John is absolutely right about Mark Duggan's critical role in this. The disability insurance program is a pretty expensive government program. Moreover, Medicare benefits are available with a short lag to people who are on Social Security's disability insurance program. There's also a separate program, the Supplemental Security Income Program, for low-income disabled people. So how we care for disabled people, what benefits we provide, what incentives the programs provide for people to work or not to work, are a really first-order issue in the federal budget, and one that has not gotten as much attention as it deserves. And Mark's one of the leaders in bringing attention to that. Okay, so this is my bit about the part of the budget that's growing rapidly. Let's spend a few minutes on the part that's not growing in the same way. So this is discretionary spending. This is the part, again, that Congress votes on each year, expressed as a share of GDP. You can see that both defense spending and non-defense spending are on a path under current law to reach a lower share of GDP than they have reached in decades. Well, why is that? Well, there are these statutory caps passed into law in 2011 that constrain total defense and total non-defense discretionary appropriations. The difficult decisions, though, about how large the appropriations will be for specific programs or specific activities will be made year by year in the future. That's kind of the way these programs work. And it's a virtue in a way, which is that Congress can change the allocation of funding in response to the perceived needs of the country. But it also means that these caps are a sort of general aspiration, that the actual decisions that we needed about what we will and won't do to meet those caps has not been made. To give you a sense of how the caps could actually be binding in a serious way, let's talk about two parts of discretionary spending. On the defense side, there are two main approaches to limiting defense spending. One is you can reduce the size of the military, the number of brigade combat teams in the Army, the number of major warships. Or you can reduce the funding per unit. You could provide less training, you could buy ships that weren't as good, and of course you do some combination of those approaches. I'll give you a feel for this. If the savings necessary to meet the caps came entirely from changes in the force structure, so the number of units, then we'd have to cut the number of units by more than 20%. So that would mean for the Army's brigade combat teams, instead of having 66, there would be 16 fewer. So the Navy having about 250 warships, it would have a little under 200 warships, and so on. Now, we don't, at CBO, analyze the strategic imperatives or the number of ships or planes you might want. We do a lot of work on the cheapest way to get a certain amount of force in place. So I can't speak to the strategic issues here. But these are large changes in the force that we have. And somebody here reminded me beforehand, in the early 1980s, the goal for the Navy was to have 600 ships. So we've had more at different times, and maybe we should have less. But the changes are substantial. The other category I want to say a word about is non-defense investment. Federal non-defense investment comes in a few categories we talk about. One is physical capital, think of highways. One is education and training. The federal government makes grants, for example, to state governments and local school districts. And another is research and development. So over the past, this chart shows the spending from the federal government in those areas over the last 40 years. We finished a report last fall that looks at investment in much more detail. All I want to say here is that if those investments remain the same share of this non-defense discretionary category that they have been in the past, then as non-defense discretionary spending is squeezed, they will be squeezed. And they also will fall to a smaller share of GDP than they've been in decades, certainly in my lifetime. Now, that doesn't have to happen that way. The Congress could decide, presumably at our general instructions, to protect the investments in this part of the budget by squeezing veterans' health care or homeland security more. Or they could decide at our instructions to support those programs and bear more of the burden of the cuts in the investments. But if the caps are adhered to, and those caps underlie our projections under current law, so the budget outlook would look worse without them, under those caps, then they're very hard choices that will have to be made and have not yet been made. I'm going to skip over that chart, actually, and just summarize at this point. What are the implications of this shift in federal spending under current law? I have two main conclusions. Deciding to sharply increase federal spending and benefits for older Americans for health care relative to the size of the economy may be quite sensible. We're going to have a lot more older Americans. We want to take care of each one of them the way we've taken care of older Americans in the past. Then spending more money is a quite natural thing to do. Or we could decide to do something different. Deciding to sharply cut spending on other things might be a sensible thing or not. But the thing that concerns us in particular, and I think concerns a lot of analysts, is that we have not explicitly decided as a society to make those changes. We seem to be drifting into the changes because, as I said, spending for the largest benefit programs is more on autopilot. Benefits are set, and without explicit action, they continue. Whereas the spending for most other activities is set through annual appropriations, where without explicit action, nothing happens. So these sorts of activities are on a very different basis in the decision-making process. And the second part of the conclusion is just to summarize that the largest federal programs are becoming much more expensive because of the retirement of the baby boomers and the rising cost of health care. As a result, even with federal spending for all programs other than Social Security and the major health care programs on track to reach the smallest share of GDP in more than 70 years, federal debt remains on an unsustainable path. And we do a long-term analysis. I didn't present charts from that today, but if you look at that, you would find that rising debt to GDP ratio at the end of this decade, that keeps going. And it keeps going with the underlying driving forces keep going in the same way. Therefore, we will need to cut benefits from those large programs or raise tax revenue from its historical average share of GDP to pay for the rising cost of those programs, or adopt some combination of those approaches. That's the choice that policymakers face, and more importantly, it's the choice that we as citizens face. Thank you. I'll stop there.
So as you all know, we have a tradition of going until 6 o'clock, pretty much sharp. But, Doug has left you about 25 minutes for questions. So let's get started.
It seems like there are a number of assumptions that have been made that you didn't really talk about, but one of the ones that we all know for sure affects us very highly. What assumptions in this analysis are made about interest rates going forward? And what other variables are the most likely to affect the outcome?
So we think that the interest rates will rise substantially from where they are today, of course, not quite to the level that they have been on average over the past few decades. So we're looking for the 10-year Treasury note rate to be 5.0% in the second half of the coming decade. I think it's fair to say there have been more concerns expressed to me that that estimate is too high and that it is too low. That doesn't mean we'll necessarily make a change, but we're looking very hard at that. Rates may not rise as much. In our long-term budget outlook last year, and we're preparing this year's already, we show the effects of different assumptions on the budget outlook. We look at interest rates, productivity growth, healthcare cost growth, and we'll add in some variables to this year's version. So those are, I think, some of the big uncertainties. We think that the overall economy will grow more slowly than it has. We think there's a recovery that will happen over the next several years. We think that beyond that, the economy will grow more slowly than it has in the past because the labor force will grow more slowly. Baby boomers are retiring, and women women's big entry into the labor force has now essentially plateaued and is coming down a bit. But so that part of the forecast, I think we're reasonably comfortable with, although we could be wrong. I think the bigger uncertainty in the economic growth is on the productivity side, which is much harder.
So,
Talk about it, the choice between raising revenues and cutting benefits. Can we talk a little bit as to what work you've done on thinking about what we really need to change the slope of the increase? We need to increase the Americans. We're all living longer, healthier lives. Don't we need to raise the age at which benefits start? Don't we need to get off of the current escalator of wage increases and go to price increases? And the same thing holds true when we look at the military. We're going to have much the same problem in the military in terms of benefits, retirement benefits and health care benefits are increasingly going to take a much bigger portion. As one of our military leaders has said, if we don't make some changes to the slope, that we're going to end up with one plane, one ship, and one tank in a decade or two. Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which you all are looking at some of these assumptions and projections?
Yes, so we did a report a few years ago, and may be updating shortly, analyzing alternative ways of changing the Social Security program. There are a number of benefit cuts, there are some tax increases, and actually there are some benefit increases, because some people, even if they want to bring down total Social Security spending, want to push it up for certain groups of people. So this report looks at a range of options, 30 or 40 different options. And we try to quantify the effects not just over the coming decade, but just the reason you say, because a lot has to do with the slope of the line. We take this out actually 75 years, which is the traditional time span for looking at Social Security analysis. And we look at the effects on the overall federal budget, but also the effects on people born in different decades. So people born in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and people with lifetime earnings at different levels. Because some of these proposals have different effects on people with low earnings in their lifetime versus people with high earnings in their lifetime. So we laid out a large menu, but I would say the Congress is not eager to pick items off the menu, and that's the part we can't do for them. We've also have looked some and are looking more now at compensation in the military. There are issues of retirement benefits. There's issues of health care benefits. As you may know, the Defense Department proposes every year certain changes in health care benefits that would save the federal government money by shifting the money, that burden, to the people in the armed forces. And every year Congress has prevented that from happening in the last few years. So again, it's not popular, but there are very few things that are popular that have those push the lines in the direction you have in mind. So we're continuing to work on that. The other issue here is healthcare, of course. And it's complicated to change the growth rate of healthcare spending because that is driven so much by the technological development and the changes in practice patterns, the sort of the procedures and treatments that doctors use. And I think those things are responsive to incentives, and it's interesting economic work about what those incentives are. But to craft federal policies that change those incentives in ways that somehow stop the less useful sorts of healthcare from being done, but don't stop the useful sorts of healthcare from being done, is very, very difficult. And I think the state of the art in the profession is not that great yet.
So I want to encourage everybody to think of asking questions. I see a couple questions here. But one of his slides showed that the elderly are net recipients of transfers and the young are net payers of taxes. And so I do encourage a few questions from the young people soon. Yes.
Thank you. Have you looked at the consequences of employment or unemployment given the tremendous reduction in military?
Consequences for the
Well,
budget,
if you
economy?
cut back on the military, those people are going to be unemployed. Those that are older will, of course, be entitled to benefits that they've earned, which could
Yes.
be huge. So what effect will these actions have on unemployment?
So our baseline projections under current law incorporate as best we can the improving economic conditions in the economy as a whole, which we think will continue and strengthen over the next few years, put more people back to work. We also take into account in the baseline projections the benefits that have been promised and we think will be collected by people retiring from the military or leaving the military without retiring, and so on. If the Congress were to cut the size of the military very sharply, I think in general, they would try not to do that by explicitly pushing people out. Like one of the challenges to people in the military of sharp changes in the size of the force is that they want to have a kind of structure. You need a certain number of privates reporting, I'm not an expert at this, each corporal and so on. So it's very hard to just like slash out make a big change all at once. So they try to do these things gradually. I think they would try to do it not by pushing people out, but by not bringing as many new people in, and by not encouraging people to stay through the kind of targeted ways that they try to keep people to stay under some conditions. And those people might end up without jobs, although we think that by the second half of the decade, the economy will be strong enough that most people who are looking for work will be able to find it again.
But you'll also have the ripple effect into the defense industries.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Again, I think at a measured pace, the economy is flexible enough to absorb a certain amount of that. Not for every person everywhere. Structural change is an issue, and we think part of why the unemployment rate is high today is because there's a mismatch between available workers and available jobs. We don't think that's the primary thing happening today, but we think it is a factor. And you're right, that if there were a sharp change in what the government did, that would make that problem worse. But we went through this in some ways in the 90s. So in the 90s, the force structure was reduced. Spending in defense came down a lot. And nonetheless, by the late 1990s, the unemployment rate was quite low in the country. So in the aggregate, I think that can be absorbed, as long as it doesn't happen overnight.
Yes, right here. Behind you, Tony, yeah.
As a resident young person here, one of my questions is that I think the CBO has the power to and has done a very good job of maintaining the academic rigor and quality of the analyses and estimates that you produce. One thing the CBO can't control is what politicians and the media then does with those estimates and reports. So one thing I'm very curious about is how accurate you think the portrayals of the CBO's work have been politically, in the popular media, and elsewhere.
So I think most reporters try pretty hard to portray our work accurately, and I think they mostly succeed. And partly they succeed by calling us as they're working on stories. And partly that is in fear of my calling them if they haven't gotten a story right. So we watch quite carefully what people write about our work. And if we spot something that somebody has written in a story, or a blog post, or a tweet that we think is a misrepresentation of our work, then we call up the reporter and say, hey, you didn't read that right. And we generally find them quite responsive to that. As I say, usually trying to get ahead of that by getting it right in the first place, and by checking with us if they need to clarify something. And I'm sympathetic, I should say, to their challenge, because we try to write our reports in a sort of plain and simple way as we as analysts can. And the reporters call and they say, okay, now how do I boil this down to make it plain and simple? So it's just a challenge to do that in column inches. I think for policymakers and advocates of various positions, the natural tendency is to cite the parts of our work that support their cause and not cite the parts that don't. And our standard analysis is there are advantages of every policy and disadvantages of every policy. And we try to give both sides. But in the political discourse, the standard line is, I have a policy idea, it has advantages. You have a policy idea, it has disadvantages. So nobody's really willing to admit that their policy idea has advantages and disadvantages, but the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So there's a lot of selective citation. And I think I just accept that. There is sometimes beyond that an actual misrepresentation of something we've said. So it's not just selectively cited, it's just miscited. And we reach out to the members of Congress and their staffs when they've done something that we think is particularly egregious. But I said in some breakfast reports a few months ago, our job is to write the material as clearly as we can and send it to the Hill, put on the website. Our job is not to be the hall monitor of the Twitterverse. And we just aren't, we're not on that all the time. And it's a little frustrating, but I feel, what makes me feel good, I think, is that when we meet with my members of Congress, or my colleagues meet members of Congress and their staffs, they are interested in what we have to say in a serious way. And I think I've just, which I think is very reassuring, and I think I just accepted that there was some sloppiness, the best way to frame it, in the public debate. But it does mean that you folks should be careful with what you read that's attributed to us. We have a website. Everything we've said is on the website. So you can go look up what we've actually said if you're curious.
Including today's talk, apparently.
Yes?
Is it Arnie and then Barnaby?
It's generally felt that productivity increases are strongly influenced by federal research with a long lag time. To what extent have you taken declining federal research funding into account in productivity increases?
So I'll say two things there. One is that we have a report underway about federal policies to spur innovation. And you can see glimmers of this in actually 2 talks I gave last year, for which the slides are also on our website. So our folks in Congress are very interested in what they might do to encourage innovation, and R&D funding would be one of those approaches, I think. Secondly, in our analyses of the effects of fiscal policy on the economy, we try to take account of the effects of federal investment on productivity. And so in this long-term budget outlook that we're working on now, that will be out in a few months, we look at alternative scenarios for the budget, and some of the alternatives have very different levels of discretionary spending, and thus presumably different levels of investment. And we will trace through we did not do this last year, actually. It's an extra complication, but we are doing it this year. We'll trace through those effects on the economy. Now, it's very hard to know, right? So federal investments are a very, very heterogeneous mix, and federal R&D support is itself a heterogeneous mix. We often do this looking at with a range of possibilities, and one end of the range we've used sometimes in the past is that federal investments have the same effect on productivity as private investments. The other end of the range might be that they have no effect on productivity. Those aren't the extremes even. You can think of things that are especially important with very high returns, or it could be especially fouled up and could have negative effects. We think that sort of captures a lot of the range. Because there are crucial pieces of the highway system, and there are bridges to nowhere. And we're not in a position to do analysis of individual proposals, although I think other groups do.
Doug, so when you do your projections of growth, I know you talked about taking 40 plus or minus iterations, right, for different scenarios. But looking out over the next 5 to 10 years, how do you account for the possibilities of substantial corrections or recessions like we had in 2008 or 2000, 2003 in your numbers? And how do you kind of point that out? Because that could have a substantial impact on a 5 and 10 year projection, couldn't it?
They can. I don't think we do a very effective job of it, to be honest. I think we do more of the uncertainty analysis in our long-term outlook, partly because over 25 years these uncertainties accumulate to be more striking, and also because it's just a time of the calendar for us and our work with the Congress. We have more time to do that work. Our 10-year analyses talk about uncertainties, but don't quantify them. And I think that's a gap that we would like to fill someday. I think the one thing we do is, if you look back over the past several decades, even leaving aside the last 6 years, say from 2007 back, output in the country has on average been below our estimate of the potential level of output. Basically, the busts, the recessions, are deeper and longer lasting than the booms are positive and lasting. So there's on average, output is a little below what it could be in the economy. And we now build that into our projections going forward. So we're explicitly making a mean expected value projection. So on average, we hope we're getting it right. But we have not, we don't present regularly analyses of how wrong we could be. Yes?
But it seems to me that, as you said, it's a potential flaw. But when you're trying to make a projection, what you're trying to do is give Congress information so they can make their projections and try to incent them to possibly take action. And it seems to me that if you are not spending a lot of time thinking about more worst case scenarios, you might be giving them the opportunity to defer actions that maybe should be taken.
I think that's possible, but there are two sides to the uncertainty cones that we draw. So we believe very strongly that we should be presenting uncertainty, and we've done more and more of that in the years I've been at CBO. So I basically think it's the right thing to do. But it's worth recognizing that when we offer a range, for a careful analytic audience, they take some understanding of the uncertainties and they build it into their decision making. But for other people, those who want the number to be big, pick the top end of the range. Those who want the number to be small, pick the bottom end of the range. So when we published last fall for the first time the long-term budget outlook, this whole chapter on uncertainty, and there was a range, some people said, oh look, debt could be as high as X percent. I think is what you have in mind. Some people said, well, CBO says debt could be as low as Y percent, so why worry? So I think there is, for analytic purposes, we think it's very important to do. Again, I don't leave any misunderstanding about that, but I think its impact on the public debate is not all virtuous.
A short question here.
Really just a follow-up on Barnaby's question, which is when you are forecasting the growth over a long term, do you use essentially a constant growth rate that will apply through the ups and the downs, or do you start with the current circumstances and then get forced into some kind of hockey stick, change, from now to 5 years out versus 5 years?
We look at the period, the next few years, where we are, the next few years from there, we think about the short-term dynamics of the economy. So at this point, we think that is a strengthening of growth, it is a decline in unemployment rate, and so on. Once we get back close to a sort of stable situation, then we don't try to predict the timing of any future downturns. We try to predict a sort of average level of GDP, and that's an average level of federal revenues and an average deficit, recognizing that we will certainly be wrong one way or the other by a lot when we get out to some particular future year.
Ethan?
Thank you. So we're in an age of extraordinary declines in labor force participation. Could you talk a little bit about the potential for long-term structural changes in labor force participation and where some pain points might develop from that?
So by our estimates, the labor force participation rate, which is the share of people over a certain age who are working, that will fall over, well, say from 10 years ago to 10 years from now, that will fall by 5 percentage points, which is a lot. And it is the combination of the retirement of this very large baby boom generation and, as I said, the end of the sort of run-up in women's participation. That has, so that leads to slower economic growth than we would have otherwise. It also potentially changes the ratio of capital to labor in the economy. Capital stock can adjust, but the initial impact is fewer workers, more capital per worker. That can raise workers' productivity. It can lead to higher returns to capital and thus higher interest rates. And over time, that higher return to capital and higher interest rates will induce, presumably, some additional saving to build up the capital stock. So there's some complicated dynamics. And we try as best we can to take those things on board. But a number of answers here have mounted to we're trying, I should just say, and we're working pretty hard. But you can get some sense from the range of questions here. There are a lot of very challenging analytic issues, many of which are things that the economics profession has not worked out. And our basic role is to take things the profession has worked out in general and apply them to particular circumstances that we confront. Cases like this, so I actually, before I came to CBO 15 years ago, did some research on this topic. So it's something that I know a little bit about, but there isn't that much out there to draw on. So places like SIEPR are important, and this is not just pandering here. There are a handful of places, a number of people around the country who are doing the kind of research that we draw on. But a lot of areas where the profession doesn't know very much. And then beyond that, we have to try to apply it to a particular situation we confront. So there are a lot of loose ends.
Thank you. Inflation is not neutral with debtors and creditors. And if you take like the last 10 years and you're going to take the average inflation rate, part of the problem in this might be too low an inflation rate. that if we have a higher inflation rate, that may actually work in our benefit to a lot of these issues.
So for what it's worth, we expect the inflation rate to come back up toward the 2% target of the Federal Reserve, primarily because we think they will adjust policy over time to try to get there and try not to have it, say, too much lower or too much higher than their target for a long period of time. It's certainly lower than their target now, and has been for a while. And you can see in the speeches by Janet Yellen and others in the FOMC that is on the minds of at least some of them. And we think we also think the strength in the economy, tighter labor markets over time will lead to some upward pressure on wages, ultimately some upward pressure on prices. So we think inflation will come back toward that point. I should say in an appendix to our annual outlook for the budget and economy, we report rules of thumb for different sort of the effect on the budget of different sort of economic variables, interest rates, inflation, economic growth, and so on. And if you don't like our basic assumptions, you can look up how much different answer we would get if we had the assumption that you wanted.
So I was just going to mention, we have one final question, I guess.
What happens if interest rates go up twice or more from where they are now on the public debt?
Bad news for the debt. I think, so that's a risk, and in our long-term outlook, that we look at a risk of higher interest rates than we expect. But I would say two things. One is there's also a risk of lower interest rates than we expect. As I noted, there's actually been more concern expressed by both academic researchers and people in financial markets to me about why our interest rate projection is as high as it is. The comments I've gotten, most people think we should be lower than we are. So there certainly is a downside risk relative to what we think. The other thing to say is that if rates are higher, it matters a lot for the economy and the budget why they're higher. So if they're higher because the economy goes on a tear, then the higher interest rates increase the debt burden, but the economy being on a tear increases tax revenue. If they're higher because people don't trust the U.S. government anymore as a borrower, so they charge higher rates to the government, nothing else in the economy is different, then it's much worse. And then actually in our long-term budget outlook, we looked at both of those alternatives. Both alternative ways of getting higher interest rates, and you can see the different effects on the economy and the budget.
Okay, I'd like to wrap it up. I have three things I was going to say. One is, I think we all admire the government service that you're doing, Doug, and you've done for a long career. It's very admirable. So thank you very much. In 2012, Greg Rawson and I took a class of sophomores to Washington, and Doug generously spoke with the class. In fact, he was the first person to speak with the class, so that was another nice thing he did. And then finally, I thought I would take a crack at doing what CBO does and publish the middle of the forecast, or the middle number. And so the average age of the questioner was 53.7. That's all, folks.